I'm sitting in my living room in Jerusalem with Nehemia Gordon, and I read Matthew 23, 2 and 3, in which Yeshua says, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, all there whatsoever they bid you to observe, that observe and do. And I tell Nehemia, there's no way that Yeshua could have said these words, and yet every Greek text on the planet says it, and he then responds, well, what makes you think that that's not what he said? And so we spent a couple hours going through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and seeing so many examples of him actually in violation of the very things that he purportedly is saying that we have to keep and do.
Or at least as it reads in the Greek. And I want to explain to the audience, why is it that I asked you that question? What makes you think that? I encounter a lot of people who will have a doctrine, and they've decided before they ever read any text or anything, this is what Jesus taught, or this is what Moses taught, and then they open up the book to look for proof for it. I don't accept that. I say, if you're going to tell me that Yeshua didn't say that, prove it to me. I mean, I'm not a Messianic, I'm not a Christian, but if you're going to tell me he didn't say to obey the Pharisees, every single thing the Pharisees, and it's great. He goes on, he talks about even the things they don't do themselves. They may not even put on the right shoe first in the morning. Nobody really does that, except, maybe the most extreme
for they say and they do not do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the point is, my point to you was, show me in the text where he says things that are contrary to obeying the Pharisees. Because I've heard some Hebrew roots people make some really strong arguments, not really strong, but they'll bring the verse in Matthew 5 and in the Sermon on the Mount, or 6, wherever it is, where it talks about, he says, if you're not more righteous than the Pharisees, well, maybe that means you should be a Pharisee and be more righteous in their way. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but could mean that.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't. But anyway, that's their interpretation.
I wanted
of it.
something more direct and definitive, and you brought me Matthew 15, which is, it's just so clear when I read it. Can we look at Matthew 15?
Well, first of all, let's set the stage on this, because this is the 20th day of the 6th month. It is Thursday, and we're heading toward the Capernaum synagogue in 2 days, where he's going to be teaching on the last day and the resurrection, which is detailed in John chapter 6.
Can I, for those who have never heard you teach on this before, Michael, are you telling us that that this particular incident took place on a Thursday, and this is in your chronological Gospels?
Right.
Wow. Okay.
Exactly, because
you've nailed this down to specific days of the week.
We know exactly when it transpires, because we know what transpires on his way to the Sabbath, what he's teaching on the Sabbath in the synagogue, and at that night, at the end of the Sabbath, after teaching on the last day in the resurrection, that's when the new moon was sighted that night, and so the first day of the week is now Yom Teruah, the day of trumpets. And so he's in the synagogue the next day with all these people.
So
and so this is what transpires. He feeds 5,000 people, men, plus women and children, with leavened bread on this particular situation.
And there was some fish in there too, right?
Yeah, there's fish, but it's leavened bread. And then what happens on Yom Teruah, the Pharisees end up showing up, and this is what we read in Matthew 15, verse 1. Then came to Jesus, Yeshua, scribes and Pharisees, which were from Jerusalem, and they said to him, why do your disciples, which again, we're talking thousands and thousands that have been following him, okay? We're not talking the 12 sent ones, apostles. We're talking about all these disciples. Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they wash not their hands when they eat bread? Okay? And so this is the issue. I mean, they're confronting him on, all these and this transpires at the end of the summer, the end of the 6th month. The 12 apostles have been sent out in 6 teams of 2. They come back together. They find out, Yeshua finds out that his cousin, Yohanan ben Zachariah, John the Baptist, has been executed. And that's when he feeds the 5,000. And the question is, what does it mean that his disciples didn't wash their hands before they eat bread? Now, only someone who's been raised in this culture, not a Baptist Jew, but someone who's been raised in this culture knows exactly what that means.
Well, and it's interesting because many Christians, when they talk about this, they'll say, well, here Jesus was nullifying the old law of Moses. And I hear that, I'm like, what are you talking about? Where in the Torah of Moses does it say to wash your hands before you eat bread? That is specifically identified in the oral law as what are called takanot, which are
Takanot
are these reforms that change biblical law. And there's a very clear distinction. I grew up with this distinction. There's mitzvot deoraita, commandments of the Torah, and mitzvot derabanan, commandments of our rabbis. Now, commandments of the Torah in rabbinical speak doesn't necessarily mean it comes from the Torah. It means the rabbis read that from the Torah. Whereas the commandments of the rabbis have no basis in the Torah. They're simply things where the rabbis enact a new law. They make these new takanot, these new enactments, and you are bound by those in some ways more than you're bound by the Torah itself. For example, there's a passage in the Tractate of Eruvin in the Talmud that says if you violate a commandment of the Torah, the punishment is lashes. If you violate the takanot of the rabbis, the punishment is death. So in some ways, it's more severe and more intense, your required observance of these man-made laws of the rabbis. So washing the hands, the whole concept of hand impurity, in the Tanakh and the Torah, there's no such things as your hands become ritually unclean. Your whole body can be ritually unclean, and then you go to the mikveh to purify yourself, or you immerse in the river, the Jordan River, to purify yourself. But the concept that just my hands would be unclean and I would have to wash them to make them clean, that's something the Pharisees invented out of the thin
just
blue air.
pure invention.
Pure invention, and they acknowledge that they invented it. When I was a young man, I asked the question, because we would say the blessing over the washing of the hands. Blessed art thou, Lord, King of the universe, who has commanded us concerning washing the hands. And I asked the question, where are we commanded to wash the hands? And believe me, this wasn't a question other people, everybody asked this question, or they shut up and they asked it, they kept it to themselves, but they certainly thought it. I asked it, and they said, well, we're commanded in the Torah in Deuteronomy 17 to obey the rabbis. And I said, really? Let's look at Deuteronomy 17 together. And in Deuteronomy 17, it talks about when you have a question, you don't know what to do, you go to the high priest at the temple, or you go to the judge who will be in those days, which later becomes the king, and which is ultimately the Messiah. The Messiah is the anointed king. He's the one who has the authority of Deuteronomy 17. The rabbis wrested that authority from God and took it for themselves. And then said, not only do we have the authority to interpret the Bible, we have authority to add commandments to the Bible that you're required to observe even more than what's written.
And that is takanot.
That's takanot. And it's interesting because in the Hebrew, are we getting to the Hebrew yet?
Yeah, well, we can.
We must get to the Hebrew,
okay,
Michael.
Okay.
So in the English here, it says in Matthew 15:3, he answered them, why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? Which it's quite clear that for anybody coming from a rabbinical background, that washing the hands is not just a tradition, it's takanot. It's these man-made laws that the rabbis imposed upon the people.
Right, it's not tradition like we would think of turkey stuffed with dressing on Thanksgiving.
And there is a category of tradition like that in rabbinical Judaism. It's called minhag. And minhag is a different sort of thing, like wearing the kippah, the skull cap. That is a minhag. It's not takanot, although maybe it has become over time. But then there are specific things.
That's a sanctified tradition.
A sanctified tradition, which is binding, but that's not the same as takanot, which is the rabbi sat down in a council one day and said, we need to make a fence around the Torah, so not only do you have to eat clean foods, you can't eat pork, like the Torah says, and you have to only eat clean species, but in addition to that, you have to wash your hands before you eat bread. That's a new commandment that they sat down and created.
And you can eat other things and not wash your hands, but before eating
specifically bread, right?
You have
For
to
example,
wash
before
hands.
you eat fish, you wouldn't be required to wash your hands. It's not a physical cleansing of the hands. In fact, if you take soap and you wash your hands like this and you wash it under the sink, it's not called netilat yadayim, washing the hands. That was, you have to take the special, jug and over the right and the left and the right and the left and make the blessing, etc. Al netilat yadayim. So I read this and I say, wait a minute, he's saying they transgress the commandment of God by their tradition. To me, it's obvious. He's saying these takanot of the rabbis are a violation of the commandment of God. And to me, this is just so clear. God commanded, Deuteronomy 4:2, Deuteronomy 12:32, don't add and don't take away from the Torah. Adding a commandment to wash your hands is no different than abolishing the Sabbath. It's you adding and taking away is forbidden in the same verses. And from it seems like what he's saying to them is, you've added to the Torah, and that's no different than taking away from the Torah. You violated the commandment of God by your takanot. And the amazing thing is, in the Hebrew Matthew, where it says here tradition, it actually says takanot.
Takanot.
That's unbelievable.
Which is legally defined. I mean, Encyclopedia Judaica tells you exactly what it is.
It's a technical term. And actually, this is George Howard's Hebrew Matthew. Let's open this up here. Matthew chapter 15, verse 3. Let me read this. Okay. It says, all right. Let's see. It says,
you need some glasses here?
I'm getting to that age, Michael, where I need the glasses to read. All right, wow. And the scales have fallen from my eyes. It says, Az ba Yeshua hachachamim v'aprushim vayomru elav lama ovrim talmidcha takanot harishonot. Why, you can even hear it, takanot. Why have your disciples violated the ancient takanot? Shehem enam rochatzim yidehem kodem ha'achila, because they don't wash their hands before they eat bread. Vayomer lehem Yeshua. So they're identifying it as takanot in the Hebrew Matthew. That's awesome.
Beautiful.
Vayomer lehem Yeshua velama atem ovrim ma'amarei ha'el ba'ad takanotechem. And Yeshua said to them, and why do you violate the words of God for your takanot? Ma'amarei ha'el, the words of God for your takanot. I mean, it's just so clear when you now look. I didn't start out looking at that passage in the Hebrew. I started out. You came to me with this problem with Matthew 23. You showed me Matthew 15 in the English.
Right.
And
showed me what happened then.
Yeah.
Okay, I present the problem to you. I have no solution.
Right.
I don't know how to do it.
Right.
And I just know this is what Yeshua said. We go through, and this is just one. I mean, we went through every one of these incidents where Yeshua is deliberately violating these takanot, which, at the time, I wasn't even thinking takanot. We just see that he's not doing what they say. They're doing the opposite. They are irate about what he is doing.
Look, so what you showed definitively between Matthew 15 and 23 is that the way it reads in the Greek and in the English is there's a contradiction.
That's right. An apparent contradiction in the ancient text, and he said, that is my field.
Yeah.
New Testament, Jesus, that's your problem.
Absolutely, right. And look, part of me said, okay, so there's a contradiction. Wonderful. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Messianic. This confirms what I already believe. The New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, can't get it straight between 8 chapters, between 15 and 23. In one place he says, all therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. And the other he says they violate the commandment of God by their tradition. But wait a minute, their tradition commands you to wash the hands. So now we've got this logical contradiction between 15 and 23. And part of me was like, okay, I don't even need to deal with this Yeshua guy anymore, because he contradicts himself. But then I said, okay, this is what I deal with. Working on my master's degree at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem is dealing with ancient texts. The first thing I did, Michael, is I went to the Greek New Testament, and they have something called a critical apparatus. So you've got this text in Greek, and I'd studied ancient Greek at Hebrew University, and it has the Gospel of Matthew in Greek, and at the bottom are a comparison of the main Greek text with over 5,000 different manuscripts in Greek.
There you go.
And I went to see
the Nessel-Allen 27th edition, probably you're looking at.
At the time, it was the 27th edition. They've moved past that now. Right. And I think now they're up to something like 5,400 manuscripts or more. Yep. At the time, they knew 5,000 Greek manuscripts. And I was looking to see, okay, so is there a difference in the Greek? And really, this was my approach. Okay, I'm not looking at this as my sacred text. But
and this is something I already told you, but you're not taking my word for anything, which that's what I appreciate. It's like, okay, I'm going to look at it myself.
Yeah. And so I wanted to look at the Greek and see, and I'm looking to see, is there some obscure Greek text that maybe Michael didn't have access to, that isn't even translated into English, that, is buried in the footnotes of the footnotes in tiny little print, where these readers wouldn't even help you. And there is stuff like that. There's stuff buried in places you'd be very difficult to find. And I was looking in those places, in the nooks and crannies of scholarship, to try to find, is there any variant somewhere that even in the standard comparison text you wouldn't find? And there wasn't. 5,000 plus Greek manuscripts, and they're all saying the same things. You got to obey the Pharisees, whatever they bid you observe, that observe and do. So then I looked at this Hebrew version of Matthew, and it's funny, I've had people who say, I'll go to speak somewhere, and the people are like, everyone's so excited to hear how you discovered Hebrew Matthew. And I'm like, really? That's boring to me. How I discovered Hebrew Matthew isn't interesting. What's interesting is what's in Hebrew Matthew.
Right.
To me.
Exactly.
How did I discover Hebrew, Matthew? I was in the library at Mount Scopus of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, sitting at one of the tables, went over to the bookshelf and pulled the book out and read it. It was sitting there literally collecting dust on the bookshelf at Mount Scopus of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, because most scholars who are experts in Hebrew could care less about it. And then the scholars who are experts in Greek, they either can't read it or they know it's Greek, so why look at the Hebrew? I decided to look at it just to see what it says. And right there in the Hebrew, this is the 1985 re-edition. Right there in the Hebrew, here's what it says. Can I read it to the people?
Please do.
Okay. So, and I guess we'll show this on the screen. It says, this is the wrong page. Let's see, Matthew 23, verses 2 to 3. I'll start in verse 1 in the Hebrew. It says, Az diber Yeshua el ha'am ve'el talmidav. Then Yeshua spoke to the people and to his disciples. Le'emor al kisei Moshe Yeshua perushim v'chachamim. Upon the seat of Moses sit the Pharisees and the sages. Ve'ata.
Okay, you want to stop here and say
what
what that means? I mean, the seat of Moses,
yeah.
because this is something, a concept outside of churchianity.
So, and the truth is, you don't really have this in modern synagogues, but my bachelor's degree was in archaeology, and I said, okay, what's the seat of Moses? Let's go find out if the archaeologists have figured this out. And they did. They dug up ancient synagogues. The earliest synagogue ever discovered is actually not even in Israel. It's on the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea in Greece. And they dug up this synagogue, and they found this ornate stone chair, which is identified as a seat of Moses. And the idea was that when you would read from the scroll of the Torah or the prophets, you stood. You stood before the congregation. But then the rabbi would sit in a special chair and interpret what was read from the scroll. And that interpretation was being spoken from the seat of Moses. And you have parallels to this in rabbinical literature.
Mosaic authority, what he says.
They had Mosaic authority. And this is talked about in the Mishnah, that if you defy what the rabbis teach, you are defying Moses himself, even if what they say contradicts Moses, because they have the Mosaic authority to interpret and even reinterpret what it says in that scroll, the scroll that was read.
And they could make takanot from that seat.
Absolutely. They've been given the authority by sitting in the seat of Moses. And he seems to be affirming this in both the Hebrew and the Greek. They sit upon the seat of Moses, but then in the Hebrew he says something very interesting. He says in verse 3, Ve'ata, and now, Kol asher yomar lachem shimru ve'asu, all that he says to you, keep and do, or diligently do, uvetakanotehem u'ma'asehem al ta'asu, but according to their takanot and deeds do not do. And he uses the word takanot there.
There it is. Beautiful.
There it is.
Beautiful.
Now, just from that word takanot, it's just so powerful.
Yeah.
It's the same contrast as in Matthew 15
and now
between the takanot and the Word of God.
And we have continuity with everything Yeshua does, everything he teaches his disciples to teach.
I've got to admit, I was a little uncomfortable with this, because what I'm supposed to do for my Jewish tradition is find all the places Jesus contradicts himself, find all the places where the New Testament is inconsistent. And you found one for me in the Greek, Matthew 23. And I open up the Hebrew that nobody's paying attention to, and I say, uh-oh, one of those contradictions disappears when we look at the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it makes more sense than it does in the English or the Greek. And I mean, I didn't hesitate. This is true. I've got to share it. I certainly had to share it with you. And I was hoping you would share it with other people, but you insisted I do it.
Well, and, this is it was such a big thing. It wasn't just that, okay, I'm not the Hebrew scholar. It's just that, okay, I'm raised in the Christian world, okay? And if I say this, it sounds like I am, anti-Jewish, anti-rabbi.
Well, this is the bait and switch. And I'm not saying you're bait and switch. I've seen this bait and switch so many times that somebody doesn't agree with the Pharisees, you're anti-Jewish. Wait a minute, I didn't say anything about Jewish. Right. I'm Jewish. What are you talking about? This is a legitimate debate and conflict, disagreement within Judaism going back thousands of years between the authority of the Pharisees and the authority of Scripture. And you're right. Now I understand where you're coming from, that if you would coming from the Baptist tradition and say, I disagree with the Pharisees, then they do the bait and switch and say, oh, you're anti-Jewish. When all you're saying is, I'm pro-Jewish. This is what Scripture, with the Creator of the universe, taught to the Jewish people, the God of Israel.
Right.
It's what Yeshua calls here in the Hebrew, Ma'amarei Ha'el, the words of God, as opposed to the Takanot, these binding man-made enactments of the rabbis. So here's the key word, though, in the Hebrew. The word is yomar. We'll show this on the screen. Yomar means he says, or it's a continuous action. He says,
right,
whatever,
and so it's a relative pronoun that goes directly back to Moses.
So it's Moses. Now, the interesting thing is there's 28 manuscripts of Hebrew Matthew, and some of the manuscripts of Hebrew Matthew, Howard said had been corrected according to the Greek. In other words, you had some Jewish scribe who was copying Matthew and saw there was something different from the Greek, and he said, if this is found out, we could get in trouble. If the Christians find out we have a copy of Matthew that differs from theirs, we're going to get burned at the stake. So there's a process of correcting it over time that Howard talked about back in 1987.
Yeah. And even you saw, the oldest manuscripts differ from the Greek to the greatest significance, and then later on...
Here's the crazy thing. He tells us how there's a correction according to the Greek and the Hebrew, but then when he translates it in English, he says, this is Matthew 23:3, he says, upon the seat of Moses, the Pharisees and sages sit, this is Howard's translation, now all which they say to you, keep and do. They is in parentheses. So I'm looking at the Hebrew side and I see he says, and in the English it says they say. And it's literally the difference between the left side and the right side. So I said, I need to go look at the manuscripts. I can't trust this printed book. If the printed book has one thing in Hebrew and a different thing in English, and I end up finding 2 of Howard's 9 manuscripts have he says, and then 2 more that Howard didn't even know about and doesn't mention also have he says, and I want to show these to the people right now.
Okay.
I've never shown these publicly as far as I can remember.
Okay, so
we're
on
going to
your
show them on the
screen.
screen. And here we have 2 manuscripts. One of them is from the Biblioteca Casanatensa, which is in Rome. And look, so if Howard wanted to see this manuscript, he would have had to go on a plane to Rome and say, do you have a copy of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew? And maybe they'd say yes, maybe they say no. They might not have known.
Right.
That is if he even knew to go to that library. I was able to go to the library at Givat Ram in Jerusalem, the National Library, and see this manuscript within a matter of 5 minutes and look at it. And I have it here on my computer screen. I'm going to share it with the people. And it says here in the Hebrew exactly actually what it says in Howard's Hebrew as well. It says, אז דיבר ישוע אל העם ואל תלמידיו לאמור על כיסא משה ישוע הפירושים והחכמים ועתה כל אשר יאמר לכם שמרו ועשו ובתקנותיהם ומעשיהם אל תעשו. All that he says to you, you shall diligently do. There it is in a 3rd manuscript. This one Howard didn't even know about. And then there's a 4th manuscript from Livorno, which is a place in Italy as well, where they had a Jewish museum and synagogue there. And they have this manuscript, and it says the same thing here, Yomar. And an interesting thing is I contacted this community, Jewish place in Livorno, Italy, and I said, I have this photograph of the manuscripts. It's not the best quality. Can you send me better photographs? And they told me they can't find the manuscript. They lent it to some professor years ago, and he never returned it. The manuscript they lent, and the guy took it home.
Oh, my
and as far
goodness.
as they know, it's in this guy's house. And I tried contacting him; he doesn't know English. So anyway, he may still have it. So but we have a photograph of this manuscript in Jerusalem. So and I have one on my computer. So.
That is how far and far-reaching this is, and to dig these things out.
Yep.
And there it was. So this is the answer right there.
Right.
Because now it's consistent. Do what Moses says to do.
And you have
Don't follow their Takanot. That's Yeshua's message.
Yeah.
If you're going to boil it down, the first Sermon on the Mount is say the scribes and Pharisees say this, I say that. And then now the final one is that, don't follow their Takanot.
Yeah.
Do what Moses says to do. Who's listening to the prophet, though? Yeah. Who's listening to him? No, we make up our celestial Santa Claus, Jesus.
Well, for me, here's what's powerful about this solution to Matthew 23 and Matthew 15. People have come up with all kinds of theories. People have, commentaries and theories. But here it is in black and white.
Yeah.
Here it is in the manuscript, and you could say, oh, well, no, that manuscript, the Jews changed it, and we can't trust them. So you're telling me the rabbi made it more...
anything the Jews do, got to be wrong.
But you're telling me that some Jewish rabbi took the words of Yeshua that contradicted and decided to make them not contradict? That makes no sense. Why would they do that? They would want to emphasize the contradictions that are there in the Greek, not translate them away. And that's what's powerful to me. This isn't a theory. You can disregard this. You can ignore it if you want. But we have 4 manuscripts that have survived that read this reading all that he says to you diligently do. And it's interesting, there was this professor who wrote a whole study, a guy named Horbury, wrote a whole response to Howard, saying how Howard was wrong, and this is in an ancient document. And he says, but we have to admit that there are these ancient readings in the Hebrew Matthew. And then he tries to say they come from some old Latin version that was lost, that came from an ancient Greek version. He's trying to like explain it away through some circuitous route, because he can't deny that there's these ancient Hebrew readings in the Gospel of Matthew that Howard discovered.
Right.
So,
and you cover this in the Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus.
Yes,
this
sir.
came out of Raiders of the Lost Book. Really,
Yeah.
that's where it all started. We did that seminar together, traveling all over the United States.
42 cities. I'll never forget it.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was a very exciting time. And at the end of it, then you wrote the...
Actually, I wrote the book a couple years before that, and we had the book at the when we did the Raiders, when we did that series. And actually, I was going to originally put up the book as a free PDF on the internet. That was my original plan. And I was speaking with this friend of mine who's a Messianic teacher. He said, if you put it up for free on the internet as a PDF, no one will take it seriously. You have to publish it as a book and charge money for it, or people won't assign value to it. And I struggled with that and prayed over it, because I really didn't want to do that. I certainly didn't want to have a book with the word Yeshua in the title. That's a surefire way for me to get tarred and feathered, but I had to do it.
You had to, because there's a choice. You can follow the Greek version of what Yeshua says, and that means that you have to obey everything that the Pharisees command you to do and observe, or you can follow the Hebrew Yeshua and actually be obedient to Moses, listen to the prophet who Moses said would come later on. That prophet we must shema, we must hear and obey. He will speak only what he hears from heaven, and this is the introduction of the Hebrew Yeshua. And Nehemia, our time is over, but would you please put the name of the Almighty upon the people as we close?
Yeah, so I love this blessing. I keep coming back to this in my life, the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. It actually is the oldest passage of any biblical text that survived in these 2 silver scrolls discovered in Jerusalem, has the Birkat Kohanim. It says, Yevarechecha Yehovah v'yishmerecha. May Yehovah bless you and keep you. Ya'el Yehovah panav elecha v'chuneka. May Yehovah shine his face upon you and be gracious towards you. Yisa Yehovah panav elecha. May Yehovah lift his face towards you. V'yasem lecha shalom, and give you peace. Amen.